thanks everyone for joining our Open Documentation Hour. I've done a couple of things that I want to share before I hand the presentation over to Artem. The main thing is that I've finally caught up with the backlog of recordings to put on the Ubuntu On Air YouTube channel, where we have a Documentation Academy playlist. The last two to have gone on were Kitana's how-to versus a tutorial, which is a really good kind of investigation into the differences between the two. Well, the difference is mostly defined by diataxis and how we differentiate between the two. And last week's great conversation, discussion, and presentation that we had on AI and the role of AI in documentation, which was hosted by Robert. One idea I had this week, which I'm going to invite people to kind of get involved in, is that it might be quite interesting to edit a document live in one of these sessions. So if any of you, anonymously or otherwise, would like to get some kind of free documentation technical writing consulting, please feel free to leave a comment on the forum or get in touch with me or anybody at Canonical directly, and we can do that. I think that'd be quite an interesting thing to try and do. I don't know how it would work, but a lot of us at Canonical kind of buddy up and work on documentation together, a bit like co-programming. And it's really interesting seeing how I think actually you'll see that there is no magic to the process, and the kind of things that you begin to look at when you first take a look at a document, and it'd be good to see the before and after working on something for 20 minutes or half an hour. I'm going to make sure that Artem has got all the required permissions to be able to host this and as co-host. So this week, Artem very kindly has offered to present a session on how to encourage engineers to write their own documentation. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Artem. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Graham. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone who joined. And today we will be talking about this particular topic, which is it visible? It's visible. Encouraging engineers to write their own documentation, and the phrasing here is important. My name is Artem. This is my second session in the Open Documentation Academy. So without further ado, let's begin with this preface. Well, obviously there's the outline, but I wanted to emphasize that I will not be talking about the particulars of this craft. Like, I will not be discussing the technicalities, the markdown dialects, the templates, the ticketing systems, the choice of GitLab over GitHub or vice versa. I will be talking about what is collectively known as soft skills, because roughly 80% of what I will be mentioning here translates into dealing with people in the workplace, which is pretty much a definition of soft skills. So let's start with some requirements and prerequisites and stuff like that. I would urge you to stop in your tracks and think a bit about what is this that we're trying to achieve here, because this is not a given. When we talk about encouraging, I mentioned that wording is important, and when we encourage people to do stuff, we can't force them to do it unless we're their boss, and this is obviously not the target audience. Well, at least the major part of it. When we talk about engineers, well, essentially this applies to anybody involved in the product, what you're trying to do, but they need to be sufficiently invested in your daily dealings. To write, I'm talking about writing here. I'm not talking about discussing documentation, about reviewing documentation, which developers obviously should also be a part of, about, you know, any general sessions on how great documentation is and how we all should do documentation. this is not my concern here. The next thing is the ownership. The the topic itself suggests that some documentation belongs to the engineers, that they own some documentation, as opposed to documentation being entirely within the realm of the technical writer, technical author. So it's also not a given. And finally, what is it? What do they own? Because at first, the go-to assumption would be, okay, we need to get developers to write user-facing docs, product docs, to contribute equally on par, if not better, than the technical authors, technical writers themselves. Oh, to the contrary, I would argue, and I would argue against that. I would argue that the best approach is to help the developers and urge them to do their own documentation work properly, of which they have a lot already. And that relates to commit logs, that is about the design documentation, that is about tests, because in my opinion, my personal opinion, you don't need to share that. Tests are also documentation because they highlight the limits and the scope of product features quite nicely. And they usually are a great help when you try to write something to figure out how something works. So just like I said, it's about dealing with people in the workplace. And the key idea, you shouldn't do their work and they shouldn't do yours. And what I mean by that is you do you. You are the expert in writing. You do polishing. You do the polishing. You do the information design, information architecture, whatever you like. And they do their small snippets of text that are attached to the, or at least that should be attached in theory to anything they do. Commit messages, Jira tickets, design documentation, change logs, whatever. So, but to be successful with this entire endeavor, you first of all, you realistically, you need to have some buy-in from the management, because there's only so far you can go without that. And it makes a lot of sense to make sure the management understands the importance of everyone being involved in documentation before you actually join the company. I was talking about that previously. And the issue here is that maybe even emphasize the importance of documentation when they hire you, but when the push comes to shove, it turns out that, okay, we can ignore your requirements or your suggestions for a while and do things our usual way. So it's up to you to throw them a few curveballs, like, for example, okay, now I want everyone to follow the semantic commit specification, for example. Can we do that, please, pretty please, and see what they have to say? If they ignore you, well, that's bad. Also, you will need some buy-in from the engineers. First of all, this comes to this entire Docs as Code thing. Like, you need to stay as close to them as possible organizationally and I don't know, professionally, like using the same tools or at least similar tools. And it also helps a lot to actively work towards earning their respect. I don't know how you do that. But in my personal practice, and I've heard people sharing the same idea, that drive-by comments to the product code base work really well, because when people see you can be as good as they are, I mean, when we talk about coding, they usually start maybe noticing you. Okay, the elephant in the room. Why would you even need to have them write their code? Spoiler alert, this is not always necessary, because in my opinion, it's perfectly fine, especially in smaller teams, to have people do their job, and you just follow them, just document what they do as they churn out their commits and features and whatever. But there is a fine line after crossing which you will probably notice that you just can't keep on track with everything that occurs within the team even. And this is probably a good sign of the necessity to get everyone on board, get everyone involved in this. And by this involvement, I don't mean that everyone should start writing product documentation. No, they should start documenting their work better for you to be able to follow up at your own pace. And to achieve that, you will obviously need to hustle a lot, really, because that requires a lot of conversations, a lot of politicking even sometimes. So if you're not convenient talking to people all the time, well, maybe find someone else, really. Okay. Oops, sorry. Now, it's time to address some false assumptions that somehow permeate the industry. And first of all, usually style guides come up in conversations like this, like, okay, you need to offer them a style guide. Well, if you make it a requirement, it doesn't work because it creates a major hurdle. It becomes an obstacle. No one will be eager to start churning out documentation if they have to follow a set of extra rules on top of that, which they are unfamiliar with. The next thing, gamification, also comes up really often. And in my personal experience, it doesn't work because, you know, mm, usually it comes out childish unless the reward for doing docs really well is quite substantial. And in my personal experience, money works really well, or at least good swag. You don't need to do it with pens, mugs, or I don't know, GitHub badges. Seriously. Yes, Iqbal? Oh, delegating. Uh, by delegating, I mean finding someone else to do this. It's simple. Uh, so, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. And the final point of controversy. Usually, you do not really, you cannot really expect people to write production grade documentation like immediately. Maybe some people will be eager to do that on their own volition, but not everybody. And this is not sustainable in the long run. And what's even worse is that getting developer to write user-facing documentation is akin to having your developer write their own tests. They tend to follow this happy path. Instead, they should maybe wear another hat and become a user for a while. And that is not maybe easy for anyone to do. One final thing. When developers document their own code, their own features, they write what they think they do. Instead, you should bring their deliverables to the point when they talk about what they actually do, because developers never know for sure, for certain, how their code works. I'm sorry. Okay, so what can we do about that? Let's talk about some strategies. What's to follow is not a radio button choice. It's more of a checkbox choice. So you have to mix and match anything that works in your particular situation, because all companies are different until they are all the same. So what goes on here? First of all, the enforcement. Hooray. If you got your manager buy-in, you can just tell people what to do. Yes, No, because it turns out that forcing people without being really benevolent and magnanimous about what you're trying to force them to do is really bad. It doesn't work because they will sabotage you again. And it's not about, rewards and maybe punishment or anything else. It's more an issue of appealing to the adult in every person you meet, because you cannot just goad them into submission. You need to be able to talk to them as equals and say, okay, Josh, I need you to do this. I need you to follow this set of rules, and I need you to have them done by Friday. Josh, you're a responsible adult person. Please go on. Okay. Uh, for that exact reason, it's really, really unwise to try to tie documentation work into the objectives and key results, into their, I don't know, monthly goals, into their rewards and or lack thereof, because it just creates this general feeling of frustration and doesn't help you further your goals in any way. But instead, what you will probably be better off doing is making it clear that any form of writing besides writing immediate code while doing your development work is serious. It's serious business. It's not to be avoided or skipped or frowned upon or I don't know. Guys, you need to do your job. Writing is a part of your developer job. Please do it well. That's all we need for that works. And you need to recognize them, not only by giving them GitHub badges or Mars or pens or whatever, but the best way to recognize someone's work is to incorporate their deliverables and recognize their input. Like they should see the result of the writing on the page. Also, please and thank you and saying stuff like that really works. So don't forget to do that. And finally, well, speaking about forcing again, you only need to annoy the offenders just enough to discourage this kind of behavior, because you probably would be better off again avoiding putting your relationship with other people on your team into any sort of dependency on how well they are doing their docs, just the same as maybe building your relationship with other team members depending on how good their code is. Don't do that, please. That really creates a toxic atmosphere. Now, speaking about education, the key difference here is that you probably need to avoid piling up sets and sets of rules and guidelines and requirements on people, instead of incorporating these rules and requirements and whatever else into some robust processes, templates, stuff like that. Bake in your expertise into these templates, give them something to follow, just ask them to fill the gaps. Okay, you need to follow this procedure, that procedure. Make it convenient, make it simple. They will follow. Just don't have them build any sort of another mental machine to interpret your rules with your style guides, your requirements. Don't make it messy. As I said, guidelines are good as long as you don't enforce them. But speaking about education, you need to be quite clear, at least about their existence, and be ready to explain what goes where and what is the reason for this and that guideline, because developers are people who can get unexpectedly opinionated about really minuscule stuff. So be prepared. Oh, it's also good to be seen, because one problem and one source of this situation, the state of affairs where writers are ignored or frowned upon or maybe not recognized, is they don't make themselves seen, they don't make themselves recognized. So you need to assume your place on the team. You need to discuss your stuff, not, at the end of the meeting for maybe half a minute. Be visible. When it comes to reviewing their submissions, their deliverables, uh, it's also quite wise to leave a lot of space, at least initially, because you will need to spend lots and lots of time discussing why you change this, why this works, why this doesn't work. Well, at least if you are willing to engage in that, because sometimes it works pretty fine just to tell them, okay, Josh, you submitted your doc. Okay, I see your comment message, your comments, your, I don't know, design docs, your whatever, your essay, your presentation. That's really great. I'm taking over and doing whatever the heck I want to do with that, and you have no say in this. Thank you, Josh. Goodbye. See you then. I will thank you in the stand-up meeting next week, sometime, probably. Be gentle about this. Okay, what's next? Collaboration. The funny thing is, developers actually spend a lot of time in the line of work fighting documentation, because this is essentially all they do besides writing code. I read this, I wrote that, I read this, I wrote that, and they have lots of heuristics about what's good and what's bad, and they have sometimes a very keen eye for what works and what doesn't. So instead of trying to override this with your seniority or authority, you may benefit from listening to them, and once in a while. I mean, and if they say, okay, I wrote this because this is how it works, and this is what we need to emphasize, okay, listen to their arguments and maybe acknowledge them and maybe agree with them, even if you don't see it working in the long run. Maybe they're right. Oh, if possible, if you come from a background that allows you to do that, dive into the code, reviews, not necessarily your code reviews. Just take a look at what's going on. Be a voice there and make documentation work a part of their reviews. So, like, for example, whom did we have? We had Josh. So John says, okay, Josh, I've done my review of your code, but your code is fine, but you didn't document it properly, and your comment message is really bad. Why don't you do something about that? When you see this happening in the wild, it's amazing. You will have tears welling up your eyes. Okay, but you don't need to get your hands dirty up to your elbows all the time. Instead, you will probably want to establish a clear, concise contact surface by saying, okay, here's my sort of writing interface. I can do this, I can do that, I accept tasks this way, I submit my documentation here and here and here. And to deal with me, you can send what you want, what you have to say about your feature or your part of code here and here and here, and here are the templates, here are the workflows, here's everything you need to do to deal with me. And establish and vice versa, you need to establish your expectations of the people you work with. because at least in my opinion, it works really great to be firm, but well, reasonable about what you expect them to do. Like, oh, I cannot find a really good example to discuss here. Maybe we'll get back to that later. Oh, yes. Of course, you will need to help them, at least initially, or anytime they need your help with doing something, just by being a generous person, because this goes a long way, really. And one final important thing here is remember the key idea from the beginning of the presentation. So you do you, and they do their job. You get the deliverables, and you do what you need to do by leveraging your expertise to incorporate it into the general scheme of things, into the general design that you have in your head, into this general structure that you don't have to explain to anybody else. And it's up to them to supply you with good enough content. And this good enough concept of quality is really important, because they don't need to be perfect. They don't need to become writers. They need to get you enough information to work with regularly. This is best for both of you. And to help you with that, you need to understand one thing. The less hurdles, the less obstacles, the better, because a major source of road bumps along the way is any sort of new stuff to learn, new technology to adopt, new rules to follow, stargaze again, and lots of manual glue to implement here. Instead, try to automate as much as possible. Try to leverage any processes, any artifacts, anything you already have in place, and establish clear interactions. Like, okay, we meet here, we discuss stuff here, we submit anything there. We need to maybe establish a ticketing system, or plan our work on Trello or whatever. And speaking about reaching across the aisle, sometimes it's best to drop the idea of maybe getting them to use Conference or SharePoint or whatever you use for your documentation. Instead, maybe ask them to supply you with Markdown or RST or ASCII doc or anything that your average developer is comfortable with. Maybe use a repo for that. Well, that turns out into I don't want to continue into a Daxos code discussion, but that's pretty much it. And again, to make this successful, you need to talk to people a lot, and you really need to negotiate, to plead, to bargain, to be a politician in the workplace. So good luck. Good luck with that. And finally, some fun stuff. One thing I wanted to mention is a situation that occurs all too often in the workplace. When you have your official product documentation, you have your official support documentation, and after that, you have some private spreadsheets, some private Google Docs, some private wikis, some team-only, I don't know, sticky notes, and a few whiteboards on top of that. And the whiteboards and the spreadsheets are really, really good until they're not. But the official documentation is really poor, because the information that is present inside just didn't make it there. So the first thing you will usually need to do when you start reaching out to people is tell them, okay, now, Josh, please Give me all you have. Surrender your shadow docs. Tell me how you really do your work, instead of trying to tell me that you have an official process for this, because it's quite obvious by now that it doesn't work as expected. One obstacle you may run into when trying to encourage developers to write documentation is a situation where you report to a developer lead, because this puts you back to square one, where you may remember this old adage that product architecture follows organizational structure, and the same goes for docs and documentation processes. If you report to dev lead, your documentation processes will be inferior to the general development processes. They won't reach high enough to be visible or to be recognizable as important. So you will be fighting an uphill battle there. And in my opinion, the best place for you to occupy when you're trying to do something like that is to have your product managers ear, to have your maybe CTO's ear even. But you need to stay on a peer-to-peer basis with the developers. You need to have lunch with them, metaphorically and literally. So that's pretty much it. And if you want to have a single outtake from this talk, is this: surrender your shadow docs now. So that's pretty much it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Artem. That was fantastic. There's obviously an awful lot of that that's come from your experience. And so if anybody would like to ask any questions, please just either put your hand up or write them in the comments and I'll read them out. I have one question to start with, which I'm sure is on everybody's lips. Artem, have you ever worked with a developer called Josh?
No.
I feel like you wouldn't say even if you had, because you blame Josh for a lot of things there.
Well, technically, the name Joshua comes from the Bible, and it's in my native tongue, this would sound like working with someone named Jesus. I would know.
So, I guess more seriously, even though you didn't say it explicitly, it seemed like a lot of what you were talking about was kind of long tail teaching in terms of changing engineering culture, trying to whisper in their ear about the benefits of documentation, whether it's through their pull requests or whether it's through doing things their way and you taking their documentation and turning it into product documentation. My question really is, do you have any kind of strategies for successfully teaching engineers about teaching them to become more committed to documentation, perhaps changing their mind about how things should be documented or how they should change their everyday practice?
Actually, yes. This slide specifically mentions documentation sprints, which is a thing that, in my personal opinion and experience, works really nicely. A documentation sprint is, well, an event where you spend maybe a few days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, just getting everyone to write documentation, like barn raising of sorts. If you can get your, again, management to spend at least some time doing that, that is usually greatly beneficial for everyone to understand the pains of writing, the problems of writing, and this usually helps a lot to get everyone on board.
I mean, one thing that I've done is that sometimes when I've joined teams and they've never worked with a technical writer or a technical author, and never really had direct responsibility perhaps for the public facing documentation is that there's always been, well, there's a lack of confidence, especially when people may not read or write or speak English natively. And you've mentioned it a lot. You need to be very sensitive to how people approach and build their confidence in doing that. And one thing that I often do is when a developer writes something that they feel should be in the documentation, I won't just like bombard them with a load of suggestions or comments in like a Google Doc. I will go away and rewrite what they've written, because you alluded to this before. Sometimes it's really, I found that a developer will often approach documentation in the same way they've approached the code, which isn't always the best way of documenting it, because you can't make the same assumptions that you can in code. But in rewriting what they've done and then presenting it to them and then saying, look, I've taken what you gave me because we couldn't have written anything had you not written anything. But this is how I would approach it, but also give them ownership over my suggestions or what I've written by saying, you decide what we ultimately publish as the product version of this docs, but this is my suggestion. Incorporate what you think has worked, but ignore what you don't. And nearly always, I'll find that they will use what I've offered to them, but also it'll change their approach when they next come to write some documentation.
Well, I do agree in that, showing that you are also a vulnerable person at that you can be talked to, that you can be persuaded, that you can be maybe that you can be reasonable instead of acting like this figure of absolute authority that your CEO threw at the unsuspecting developers helps a lot, and it really goes a long way. And I think I did use a lot of wording here, helps a lot with that. You need to be, well, you need to dress softly, really.
Could I also ask you, anyone else, please feel free. You mentioned how important it is for us to have social skills, which I'd never really thought about before, not considering myself particularly sociable. What kind of, do you have to be like an extrovert as a personality wise, or do you have to have any kind of specific social skills? Can you develop them?
I'm a firm believer in the school of thought that says that anything can be learned by practicing long enough. Not hard enough, mind you, but long enough. So yes, you just need to maybe make a decision. Okay, I want to start doing that. Well, it's kind of a mind trick, because this usually comes like this. Okay, I want to be a sociable person, but what a sociable person does, they talk to people a lot. Well, then I may want to start talking to people, maybe not a lot, but gradually increasing the time spent doing that.
So when you delegate to a more sociable person, like you mentioned earlier and Iqbal mentioned, you should also maybe listen to them and be involved in the same conversations if you don't have that kind of confidence.
Well, honestly, that was more of a euphemism for giving up. Sometimes it's okay to give up and admit, okay, I cannot do that because I'm just not capable of doing that right now. Maybe I can learn to do this, but not yet. That's okay.
Yeah. And you'd still be okay as a technical writer, even if you don't have those social skills to start off with?
Yes. Julia?
First of all, I really liked your presentation, because I strongly agree that our role as technical writers, technical authors, requires a huge amount of, diplomacy, soft skills, willingness to listen, and all that you said, nudging, encouraging, guiding. It's something that's not so obvious all the time. So I think it's great that you brought it up, because getting engineers to write, it's not just about the tools, but it's about, establishing a meaningful connection with them. So yeah, I just wanted to say that this was something that strongly resonates with me. I think it's absolutely true, and something that people don't realize maybe about the technical writing profession.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Julia. You're right. I haven't really thought about this side of it. Especially when Artem said about you need to be a politician. I really understand what he's saying. But I think about, well, in the UK anyway, maybe in the Yes Prime Minister style, I've always thought of us as being like civil servants, where you're kind of whispering in the ear of people and trying to influence the things that they do and the decisions that they make, but you don't necessarily get recognized as the instigator or the participant in that, in those conversations. Yeah, the Doc's whisperer. Yeah, Kitana, go for it.
Hopefully you can hear me. I'm on my mobile.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah. First of all, thanks, Artem, for that fantastic session. So I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that my biggest takeaway from this is the collaboration strategies, apart from all the other strategies that you shared, Artem. I realized that I have been thinking about collaborating with the engineers that I work with, educating them about the importance of docs, how to write perfect docs. But I realized my biggest mistake of all, that I never reassured them that it is okay to provide their shadow docs, any form of documentation, basically. So, the moment I realized that, it was like, oh, I should have done that at the very beginning. So that's the biggest takeaway that I'm going to take from this session, and I'm going to restructure my approach all over again. And thanks for that. Yeah.
You're welcome. I also found a typo. Happens to anybody.
I'm terrible with that particular typo, and honestly, it's more muscle memory than anything else. It's the kind of thing I've typed it before I've even thought about it.
Yes, and getting back to Kirtana's feedback, well, for me, this usually, again, it's soft skills on over and over, because it comes to talking to people instead of talking at people. Just that.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
Anybody else have any questions? I've got a couple. I made some notes while Artem was talking. I really felt like one of the things that did make me kind of think was you saying that developers shouldn't write their own tests, and that because you said that they'll only write a test that kind of goes to their happy path, which I guess you means they'll write a test that they'll make sure passes but isn't necessarily objective. And you feel this, I think, by implication, the same about them writing product facing documentation. Do you think that is an ideal? Do you think that's something that we have a responsibility to change?
I'm not sure about changing anything, actually. I'm sure about challenging them, about questioning them, about acting in a very, very structured adversarial fashion. Like, are you sure? Are you aware that it's not like it doesn't work the way you say it works? Stuff like this. Because exactly for the reason that as people write the tests to show up green 100% of the time, they write their docs to present their work in the most beneficial way possible, unfortunately. Sorry. If any developers listen to this. Nick
wants to comment.
I'm sure they're used to it by now. I just meant to say that sometimes it's probably not intentional that For example, when you're writing code and you write tests for the code, yeah, sure, that you may write tests that are going to pass, but in a way that's inevitable, because even if you've done a great job of writing the code, the act of writing the code is to try and consider all the possibilities. So you're going to create a test which mirrors the possibilities that you thought of. You can't anticipate things that you didn't think of, and I think it's the same for the writing. Although sometimes you do see very shabby contributions which are based on people assuming that something is going to work the way they imagine it works, and they type out commands and they don't actually run through a whole sequence of stuff to verify that it actually works before writing out some docs. So I just wanted to I guess give some sort of excuses, but I don't think it's I think you're right in that it often takes another perspective on something, and that's true of anything. That's true of when we create our docs as well. You know, you can only imagine the things that you can imagine, and sometimes other people come along with other things that they've imagined instead, and you know, and it's that's part of the process. I mean, it's a great skill to be able to think to be able to think of all sorts of different possibilities, but inevitably someone is going to come up with something you haven't thought of. So everybody has to get used to that sort of feedback loop, I guess.
Oh, thank you, Nick. I actually never implied it's intentional. In my experience, this is always subconscious, unless we're talking about malicious agents here. And it's really hard. It's seriously hard to maintain an accurate and non-biased mental model of what you're trying to do, as opposed to what you are actually building and what it is in reality, because you always end up with this happy mental landscape where there's a happy mental railroad and your happy mental choo-choo train is doing happy circles. And outside of that, you don't know nothing about your product, your work, because nothing ever occurs, nothing bad happens in your happy land. And when people arrive and start stomping on your happy train with their uncomfortable truths, it's really, really, really annoying.
Thanks, Artem.
It's necessary.
Just read out a couple of comments from Iqbal. By the way, if you join DevSec, you may delight yourself in being somewhat totalitarian in project governments. Regular dev people have a more on-the-go attitude sometimes, but if you're leading a security conscious group, you can enforce strict rules that most people don't follow, and your community will cheer you for it. So I guess in some ways there are places where, you know, you're cheered for holding the line, I guess.
Oh, that's nice. I'm not sure how this relates to the topic of the conversation, but that's really nice. Thank you, Iqbal. By the way, people were asking about the slides. They will appear on our Discords in a while, I think.
Yeah, if you share them with me, I'll make sure they're linked to the YouTube video, and I'll put them on the Discourse post. And there'll be a recording of this as well, like there are for all the others. I've got, if you don't mind, I've got another question, and it's kind of related to, have you had success in helping engineers understand the role of a technical writer in their team when they're the ones writing the documentation and can often feel opinionated about how the documentation should be written?
Actually, yes, I'm happy to say that. It's not all pure theory. So this comes in many flavors, actually, but one story I am quite confident in sharing with you is this. People start recognizing the value of having a writer on the team, having a documentarian on the team doing documentation work, when they realize that documenting their code actually improves it, because it allows everyone to see the drawbacks, the failures, the downsides of their design decisions, because all too often it occurs that maybe some insufficiently or poorly designed features are recognized as such only when you are trying to document them. Because if the documentation isn't working out, this too often points to the fact that it's the feature that's bad, not the docs or the writer. And I'm happy to say that I was recognized more than once for this. I mean, outside of, getting your fingers in the code base, fixing occasional bugs and stuff like this, because that requires some developer expertise, but you can just point to the simple fact that, okay, guys, this feature is really hard to document. Are you sure that it needs to work this way? Oh, no, we intended it to be entirely different. Thank you. That's how it goes.
I feel the same. I mean, as a technical writer, we're in the engineering teams, and we usually participate in our respective engineering teams' daily stand-ups, and it can be very intimidating at the beginning, where you join and they seem to be accomplishing so much in terms of code, and you're still working on one doc. And if you don't have the confidence, that you feel like, yeah, I'm still working on one doc day in, day out. But having worked with teams for years, working on these one docs, helping them understand that it takes time to create great documentation, it's really difficult. And in the end, the results hopefully speak for themselves, does win them over.
Yep.
Perhaps one last question. One thing that I'd written down was you mentioned, you end on how important it is to ask people to hand over their shadow docs. And I really wanted to know, what did you do with these internal handbooks? How did you kind of turn them into something that you could use on the product documentation, or did you just put them in the trash?
Well, it turns out that these usually contain a plethora of knowledge that was somehow, it wasn't exactly hidden, but it just didn't come up because no one thought it's that important to mention that. And it was so immensely helpful in organizing the actual official user-facing product documentation that I cannot really emphasize how important it is. That's why I made it the single outtake, or at least suggested as one. You need to, because all you need is almost certainly already there. You need to dig it up, and start by digging it up. And from that, you build your processes, your interactions, your workflows by working with what you already have. Just by polishing it, streamlining it, hammering into line, to quote Kipling.
Thank you, Artem. That was brilliant. So I'm going to wrap up the recording now. I think we'll put the recording on YouTube with the link to Artem's slides. And don't forget, if you're interested in sending us something that we can work on in public in one of these sessions, totally anonymously, obviously you get to keep the results, but it will be public. I think that'd be quite a good thing to do. And I also wanted to mention that next Friday, we've got an engineering director at Canonical who's particularly good at understanding all of the things that Artem has just said and creating a documentation culture with their engineers. This engineering director is going to be giving a presentation on their style and how they've made it happen. So I look forward to seeing that next week. But otherwise, thanks very much for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.